Mike in Anchor Point, Alaska. Oh, my phone won't stay still. Give that a try. So, I'm a single Orthodox Christian living by myself on the banks of the Anchor River in my log cabin in Alaska. This is the furthest west highway point in North America. I'm going to read The Athlete of Virtue, St. Sergius of Radona. Try to say it right. If someone knows if I'm saying it wrong, please correct me. St. Sergius of Radona. The lives of the saints, as well as their writings, are one of the ways that we learn about the spiritual life. In reading attentively the lives of the saints, one of the first things we learn is that the saints are neither distinctively Russian or Greek nor any other nationality. They are at all times Orthodox and Christ-loving. They breathe forth the same spiritual fragrance no matter when or where they lived. One of the most beloved saints of Russia, St. Sergius of Radona, whose life for countless generations of pious Orthodox, both young and old, served as a source of spiritual nourishment. And so it can for us only if we read it, not so much with our minds as with our hearts. A Greek bishop, a contemporary of St. Sergius, doubted the many reports he had heard concerning the saint's sanctity, and said, "Can there be such a lamp in this land and in these latter times?" Desiring to see for himself, he set out for St. Sergius Monastery. But no sooner had he seen the saint when he was struck blind. The saint took him by the hand to his cell, and there the bishop confessed his unbelief and begged with tears for healing. The saint touched his eyes and healed him, exhorting him not to come tempting the simple monks again. The bishop, now enlightened, spoke loudly everywhere, and having seen a true man of God, a heavenly man, and earthly angel. How many of us approach the reading of lives of the saints, our minds clouded by doubt, skeptical about the miracles and thus blind to the treasure of holiness which they contain? Let us heed the example of the Greek bishop and beg God to open our mind's eye, for only in this way shall our reading of these lives be spiritually fruitful. St. Sergius was born in the year 1314 in Rostov of pious and devout parents. Even before his birth, God worked a miracle upon the future saint. While still in his mother's womb, he cried aloud 3 times during the Divine Liturgy. His biographer says that from this moment his mother carried the child in her womb as if it were a precious treasure. She guarded herself from every stain of sin, observing a fast. Baptized with the name Bartholomew, the growing boy was a poor student. Unable to learn how to read, he often prayed to God in secret, "O Lord, give me understanding of learning." One day he met in the fields a holy elder of angel-like appearance who asked, "What are you seeking, my child?" The boy replied that he wished most of all to read and write. Assuring him that for his faith the Lord would give him learning, the elder, at the boy's entreaty, accompanied him to his parents' house. They all went into the house chapel, and the elder told the boy to read aloud from the Psalter. "Father, I do not know how," Bartholomew said. But after the elder commanded him to speak the word of God without doubt, the boy began to read easily. Then the elder foretold the parents that their son would be a dwelling of the Holy Trinity, that he would be great before God and man, and that he would direct others thanks to his virtuous life. Some time later it fell on Bartholomew to care for his parents in their old age, a task he willingly undertook, although he wanted to become a monk. After his parents died, he abandoned the world, and together with one of his brothers, he went deep into the forest to build a cell in a small church dedicated to the Holy Trinity. His brother was unable to remain long with him, so Bartholomew continued in the forest alone. At the age of 23, he received the monastic tonsure with the name Sergius. Late one night when the saint was praying, he heard a voice calling, Sergius, opening the window of his cell, he beheld a marvelous vision. An extraordinary radiance shone in the heavens, and a multitude of beautiful birds filled the air. He was touched by wild animals, especially bears. One bear in particular would come to the saint. Seeing that the animal came only to get some food, the saint would place a small slice of bread on a log. Often there was no bread, and both he and the bear would go hungry. Sometimes the saint would give his only slice to the bear, being unwilling to disappoint him. Let no one be astonished at this, knowing certainly that when the Holy Spirit dwells in a man, the creatures become submissive to him, just as to first created Adam in the beginning. After 2 years, God-fearing monks came to dwell with St. Sergius. Although he had gone to the forest to work out his salvation in solitude, St. Sergius accepted their arrival as God's providence and said to them, "Know that if you have come to dwell in the wilderness, the beginning of righteousness is the fear of the Lord." Each monk built his own cell, and all gathered with the saint for the divine services in the chapel. A priest came from a village for divine liturgy until finally the saint was persuaded to accept ordination, at which time the bishop also named him abbot and exhorted him to remember the saying, "Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ." Galatians 6:2. If you follow this precept, you will save yourself and those who live with you. St. Sergius remembered this all his life and was not only a father but also a servant to all those who came to him. St. Sergius worked at grinding grain, baking bread, cooking food, and making candles, as well as making shoes and clothing for other monks. He never spent an idle hour. Remaining thus in ceaseless prayer and labors, he completely wore out and refined his flesh, having the constant desire to be a citizen of the Jerusalem that is above. Over and over he reminded his monks, God's grace cannot be given without trials. After tribulation comes joy. Multitudes flocked to him, wishing to be part of this growing family of monks. When dissensions arose, the saint did not enter into them, preferring, as when the monks would not accept correction, to be silent rather than to participate in any strife. Once after prayer before an icon of the Mother of our Lord Jesus Christ, a dazzling radiance shone upon him, and he beheld the most pure one. Together with the apostles Peter and John, the bright light of the vision was unbearable, and he fell to the ground. But the Mother of God, touching him, promised that she would be with his monastery during his life and afterwards protecting it. Continually chastening himself with fasting, working unceasingly, performing numberless miracles, the saint reached advanced age. The older his body grew, the stronger grew his fervor, in no way weakened by age. With the approach of death, which he foreknew, he gathered his flock and delivered a final exhortation. He made them promise to be steadfast in orthodoxy and to preserve oneness in mind with each other, to keep pure in body and soul, and to have unhypocritical love, to avoid all evil and carnal lusts, to be moderate in food and drink, above all to be clothed with humility, not to forget love of strangers, to avoid backtalk, and on no account to set value on honor and praise in his life, but rather to await reward from God and the joys of heaven and eternal blessings. He surrendered his pure holy soul to the Lord in the year 1392, on September 25th, being 78 years of age. After his death, the saint's body gave off an ineffable, sweet fragrance. His face shone white as snow. Angels preceded him after his repose and opened for him the doors of paradise, and what he had always desired, the illumination of the most holy Trinity. The Mother of God has kept her promise to St. Sergius. His monastery was one of the last to remain open under the Soviet yoke, and countless pilgrims still come to venerate his holy and incorrupt relics. So remarkable is the life of this wondrous saint, so full of miracles, that we tend to overlook those points which with prayer can be applied to our own circumstances. Even his childhood gives a picture of an exemplary Christian life. How many contemporary mothers are so solicitous over the spiritual needs of their children, even while they are still in the womb? How many of us first turn to God in the time of need and teach our children to do likewise? And how many young people of today sacrifice their own desires in order to care for their parents in their old age? And who among us can afford to disregard the saint's example of constant labor, even at menial tasks? Furthermore, while our society places such a high value on secular education and even theological degrees, can we not see from this life that it is not so much the reading of books we must cultivate, but rather the fear of God and the practice of his commandments? If only we would be more inclined to follow the example of St. Sergius. In his book on the Saint, Pierre Kovalevsky writes, throughout his life he remained a man for whom the Christian experience was more important than learning or reason. He never wrote anything, and he drew his knowledge not from reading, but from his continual communion with God. His vocation was not to speculative theology, but rather to the application of the gospel's precepts. No, this is an especially good life to retell to our children. See Parents' Children in Lent. Explain to them that St. Sergius is called in his Troparion an athlete of virtues, because those who exercise or practice the virtues are just as much in training for a competition or contest as modern-day athletes in the sports arena. The difference is that whereas the merely physical athlete competes for an earthly passing glory, the prize for a spiritual athlete is the unending bliss of paradise. St. Sergius of Radozna, St. Sergius of Radonez, and the Hesychast movement. St. Sergius of Radonez, one of Russia's most beloved saints and credited by many as being the central force of the monastic revival in Russia during the 14th century, has been compared with many of the Hesychast fathers of his era. A recent example is his being referred to as a Hesychast monk in a modern compendium of Orthodox theological articles, giving that the saint's life and work were contemporaneous to the Hesychistic controversy and the Pelamite synods of 1341, 1347, and 1351. We can argue that there may be the possibility of him having been exposed to hesychastic literature and polemics at some point. However, what must be investigated is whether the saint considered himself a hesychast or at least a transmitter and practitioner of the tradition, and if the church viewed him as such on his canonization. It is true that in Orthodox spiritual life, theology, asceticism, and hesychasm cannot be separated one from another, all three being key components of a Christian path of purification, illumination, and deification, especially in the monastic life where they are experienced and lived in their fullness. Neither was the hesychastic controversy of the 14th century a reaction against some new teaching, hesychasm, although present in the Old Testament and apostolic eras, developed in its current form at the same time as the rise of monasticism in the 3rd century onwards as part of the church's living dogmatic tradition. It has its ideological background in the mystical writings of St. Dionysius the Areopagite, and is especially mentioned in the writings of the monastic pioneer St. Anthony the Great, who is quoted as saying, "Let us be men of silence and hesychasts." The majority of monastic writers from the 3rd century onwards, in particular St. Macarius the Great and St. John of the Latter, referred to hesychasm either implicitly or explicitly, showing its deep roots in Orthodox Christian tradition. With hesychasm and the Orthodox monastic tradition being effectively inseparable, one could quite justifiably ask why we should mark out specific monastics, saints as being hesychasts or part of the hesychast movement in general. Hesychasm is a specific practice of stillness, hesychia, and watchfulness, nepsis, or the guarding of the heart, usually centered on the use of the Jesus prayer or the repetition of the name of the Savior. The latter practice first recorded in the martyrdoms of St. Ignatius the God-bearer and St. Neocorus. Monks who practice hesychasm are notable and having achieved a very high spiritual level and a state of constant contemplation, theoria, of God through mental or noetic prayer. Hesychasm is the primary method, for want of a better term, of the purification of the heart, the illumination of the nous, and eventually the glorification of the individual. The writings of hesychastic fathers mention revelations of the uncreated glory of God to the illumined Christian, who often called the uncreated light or the Taboric light, which is the same as that which disciples witnessed at the Transfiguration. In a sense, the practice of hesychasm is merely the concentrated and dedicated pursuit of that which all Christians are called to do, deification and the vision of the uncreated glory of God. For the sake of this paper, we will define hesychast and the hesychast movement as being those fathers who were influential in establishing the basic teachings of hesychasm, defending it during the attack of the Barlamites, and propagating it to the rest of the Orthodox world at large, especially during the golden age of hesychasm. This golden age can be estimated to begin in the late 13th century with the labors of St. Gregory the Sinaiite. St. Gregory the Sinaiite, who began his monastic life on Mount Sinai, before learning Noetic prayer on Crete and subsequently taking up residence on Mount Athos, where he refined the teachings of hesychasm and wrote his 150 chapters on mental prayer. A younger contemporary of his St. Gregory Palamas was the man chosen by his brother monks to defend the hesychasts when they came under attack from Barlaam and the Calabrian and his followers in the early 14th century. The hesychastic controversy erupted when Barlaam, a Greco-Italian monk and philosopher, was scandalized by what he thought were erroneous and heretical practices of the Athonite monks and attacked the hesychastic tradition in his writings. St. Gregory Palamas was mobilized to defend hesychasm, and in his many writings, specifically triads in defense of the holy hesychasts, fought against Barlaam's accusations. After a long conflict during which both parties held the ecumenical throne at certain points, hesychasm was eventually exonerated and Barlaam condemned in a series of councils in Constantinople in 1341, 1347, and 1351. Although the major battles of the hesychastic controversy were fought at the Ptolemite councils under the Patriarchate of Constantinople within the Roman Empire, the Russian Church was not without its activity in this period. Contemporary metropolitans of Moscow were involved, albeit at a distance, and keeping abreast of developments in the empire, the Metropolitan of Moscow, St. Theognostes, was a Ptolemite, and a copy of the tome of 1341, where his signature exists in the Moscow Synodal Library. When the anti-Ptolemite faction was in power, he suffered deprivation of income until order was restored. His successor, St. Alexius, was a favorite of the Patriarch of Constantinople. Philotheos, who was a strong Ptolemite and supported St. Alexius in his struggles with a Novgorodian hierarchy. St. Alexius was also a monastic co-struggler with St. Sergius's brother Stephen at the monastery of the Theophany in Moscow, and later became closely acquainted with St. Sergius. Against this backdrop of ecclesiastical conflict in Constantinople and repression by the Tartars in Russia, St. Sergius and the world Bartholomew, along with his brother Stephen, set out for the forest near his hometown of Radonez. The intention was to go into the wilderness and live like desert ascetics of Egypt. They established themselves in a clearing and built some dwellings in a church dedicated to the Holy Trinity. The brothers live an austere ascetic life, too austere for Stephen, who returned to cenobic monasticism at the monastery of the Theophany. The saint continued his labors as a solitary and was eventually tonsured by Elder Mitrophanes when he was 23 years old, taking the name Sergius. Having spent the early years of his monastic life in complete isolation, one can wonder how St. Sergius learned of the spiritual teachings of the church fathers that he put into practice. As can be seen in his life, St. Sergius was chosen from the womb for his holy task and received his learning not from men, but from God. However, his God-given spiritual gifts do not necessarily need to rule out book learning, and after having received the gift of reading at the age of 7, he was known for reading the Holy Scriptures, the Church's liturgical texts, and the writings of the Church Fathers, which were all available from Rostov Library. Not only this, but his youth had been a preparation for the rigors of the ascetical life led in the wilderness, with strict fasting from a young age and the ceaseless repetition of the Psalms. In itself, a practice rooted in the hesychastic monasticism of the Egyptian desert. The youth's ability to read, as well as his access to ecclesiastical writings, opens up the possibility that he was exposed to hesychastic literature from a young age. During the 14th century, innumerable translated texts of hesychast literature found their way northwards. From monastic centers in Constantinople and elsewhere, the Russian monks in Constantinople and on Mount Athos were known to receive books from the Bulgarians, which were copied and sent back to Russia. There are manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries still in existence today of classic writings such as the complete works of St. Dionysius the Areopagite, writings by St. John Chrysostom and St. Ephraim the Syrian, and most importantly for our study, St. John Climacus the latter. Writings of St. Nilus of Sinai, St. Dorotheos of Gaza, St. Isaac the Syrian, St. Simeon the New Theologian, and most of the spokesmen for the contemporary hesychast movement in Greece. St. Gregory the Sinite and Callistus and Ignatius Xanthopoulos. Surprisingly, no translations of St. Gregory Palamas's work exist from this period, other than a copy of his Against the Latins. What is known is that the library of St. Sergius Monastery did contain Slavonic translations of some of these texts in the 14th and 15th centuries, although whether they were there during the saint's tenure as abbot is uncertain. With potential access to such profound writings, as well as regular encounters with the monastics who struggled in his local monasteries, we can imagine that the young St. Sergius' spiritual development could have been heavily influenced and informed by the hesychastic tradition of the Church. Despite this, Fedotov maintains that it would not be possible for the young saint to acquire the sufficient knowledge of ascetic literature and patristic writings by the age at which he set off into the forest. However, what is impossible for man is certainly possible for God, and the spiritual drive that St. Sergius had from his youth could certainly make up for his lack of knowledge in these matters. By the time of St. Sergius's exodus into the forest, most Russian monasteries were in urban areas or on the outskirts of inhabited places. However, in its beginning, monastic life in Russia had been established on the premise of anchoretic spirituality of Mount Athos. On Mount Athos, with a strong hesychastic tradition preserved there, monasteries were generally divided between Cenobia and Hesychasteria, and with the average cenobic monastery having one or two hesychasteria nearby. St. Anthony, founder of the Kiev Caves Lavra, had been a monk at the Great Lavra and had experienced both the cenobic and eremitic life whilst on the holy mountain. Having returned to his native land, he took up residence in a cave near Kiev and commenced his struggles. Eventually, with a brotherhood gathered around him, the monastic center for Kievan Rus par excellence was formed that became the standard for all Russian monasteries. It was the period of St. Theodosius's abbacy that firmly established the Russian monastic tradition when he built up the monastic churches and dormitories, introduced the Studite Typicon from Constantinople, and regularized the monks' lives along a more semi-hermetic fashion. It has also been noted that it was during this time that the use of the Jesus Prayer in Rus was first recorded. Most likely carried over from St. Anthony's time on Athos. Saints Anthony and Theodosius died in 1073 and 1074, respectively, with the latter spending 12 years as abbot from 1062. St. Anthony was never abbot of the monastery, instead spending his life in relative seclusion as the spiritual father and avoiding administrative responsibilities, devoted to the spiritual guidance of monks and visitors to the monastery. St. Sergius's community and those that followed were not of the urban monastic spirit, contemporaneous with the rest of Russia. Their spirit was that of the desert. However, when the time eventually came for St. Sergius to establish his brotherhood as a monastery, the community was established on cenobitic grounds. Prior to this, St. Sergius and his small group of 12 monks had observed a semi-hermetic, modified Studite typicon and the full cycle of divine services, except the divine liturgy, which was occasionally celebrated by visiting clergy from the area. With the Brotherhood's plea for St. Sergius to be made abbot answered and the saint's ordination to the priesthood, the Jerusalem typicon of the Lavra of St. Sabas, the Sanctified, was introduced, as it was all over the Greek and Russian world in the 13th and 14th centuries. The establishing of a cenobitic community was at the behest of Patriarch Philotheos of Constantinople, a disciple of St. Gregory Palamas, who personally wrote to the saint. One of the main reasons for this thrust from semi-hermetic to cenobic monasticism, which was mirrored all over the Orthodox world, surprisingly came from the hesychasts themselves, who thought that too much individualism was developing in some of the monasteries, which had led to ideorhythmic foundations springing up. Another more practical reason is that a community life would be more conducive to survival, especially in Russia's frozen north. St. Sergius's desire to live the life of a desert anchorite had led him to become abbot of what would become Russia's major cenobic monastery. As it goes, Jerusalem Typicon found good soil in Russia, being close to the Russian spirit, allowing the monks to contribute to the world around them and conduct missionary work. Although St. Sergius and his monks worked out their salvation within the framework of a cenobic community, balancing hard labor with dedication to the church's divine services, they still managed to maintain some of the practices associated with hesychasteria in their daily lives. The monks practiced revelation of thoughts, with this taking place at the fourth ode of the canon during Matins. Fasting was strict, and many stories abound of the Brotherhood's early days when scarcity of bread led to the monks going without food for days on end. St. Sergius forbade his monks from begging for alms, which eventually led to a rebellion by the brethren. Despite this severity, the initial rule used by the brothers, that of the Studite monastery, had in fact been relaxed by St. Sergius, who lessened the demands of rigidity and emphasized humility and gentleness. Another local practice highlighting St. Sergius's fatherly role as one guiding his monks along the narrow path was his nightly inspections of the monastic cells after compline. After completing his own cell rule, he would go on rounds of the other brothers' cells, rejoicing if the monks were praying and making prostrations, reading books or weeping over their sins, and rapping doors if he heard monks conversing or laughing. The following morning, monks who had disappointed him were gently reprimanded. One of the central teachings of the hesychastic tradition and the focal point for Balaam's outrage was the concept of uncreated grace, or uncreated or taboric light, which could be seen by the Christian who had received a revelation of God's glory. Although the author of St. Sergius's life, Epiphanius the Wise, lacked the theological articulation to bring our attention to this facet of the saint's inner life, there can be no doubt that the taboric light is indeed alluded to. It is worth quoting in full some of the accounts of visions of heavenly fire and angelic concelebrants at the divine liturgy, the latter being a definite sign of a person's high level of sanctification. We should bear in mind that it is impossible to accurately describe the uncreated glory of God in human terms. The first example is the vision of divine light witnessed by St. Sergius. One day the saint, according to his usual custom, was keeping vigils and was praying for the brethren that the Lord help them in their daily work and improvement. And while he was so praying deep in the night, he heard a voice saying, Sergius. But he was very surprised by this unusual night call, and after he said his prayer, he opened the window of his cell, wishing to see who called. And right away he saw a wonderful vision. A great light appeared from heaven and drove away all darkness of the night, and the night was illumined by this light, which excelled by its brightness the light of day. For the second time the voice was heard saying, Sergius, you are praying for your children, and the Lord has accepted your praying. Look carefully and see a multitude of monks who are gathered in the name of the holy and life-giving Trinity in your flock to be taught by you. The saint looked and saw a multitude of very beautiful birds that flew not only over the monastery, but also around the monastery. And the voice was heard saying, As you saw these birds, in like manner the flock of your disciples will be multiplied, and even after you they will not diminish, if they choose to follow in your footsteps. The vision of the angelic concelebrant was narrated in the life as follows. He saw at the altar a fourth man co-celebrating with him, a very wonderful man whose sight was strange and indescribable, shining with great brightness, and the face with radiating vestments. And during the first exit, that angelic-like and wonderful man came out after the saint, and his face was shining like the sun, so that it was impossible to look at him. His vestments were unusual, wonderful, shiny, so that they looked like they were of golden designs. Isaki asked Father Makari, who was standing close by, What is this wonderful sight, Father? Who is this wonderful man whom we see? And Makari, who was also granted to see the sight and the appearance of the great brightness, said, I do not know, child. I see this bright and unutterable sight, but I think that this is a servant who arrived with the prince. Prince Vladimir was at the time in the monastery. Then they approached and asked those who were with the prince if he had come with him, and they answered no. Then they knew for certain that it was an angel of God who was officiating with them. A vision of heavenly fire was reported about this saint thus. When the saint was celebrating the divine liturgy, there was also present a disciple of the venerable ecclesiarch Simon, whom we mentioned before, who was perfect in many virtues, of whom also the Holy Starets himself witnessed that he had a perfect life. This Simon saw a wonderful vision. Once when the saint was officiating, he said to him he saw a fire moving over the table of oblation, illuminating the altar and encircling the holy gifts. And when the saint was about to partake of the Holy Communion, the divine fire rolled itself like a shroud and entered the holy chalice. And so the saint took communion. As Simon saw that, he was frightened and was filled with trembling, and so he marveled in himself. When the saint moved away from the table of oblation, he understood that Simon was granted to see this wonderful vision, and so he called and said, Child, why is your spirit frightened? He said, My Lord, I saw a wonderful vision that the grace of the Holy Spirit is operating in you. The saint forbade him and said, Do not announce to anybody what you saw until the Lord orders my departure from this life. And they rendered praise to the Lord together. Such events are commonplace in the lives of the saints, particularly those renowned for their ascetic struggles. Even accounts of contemporary hesychastic fathers in places such as Mount Athos, Romania, and Mount Sinai have stories of similar visions of lights, fire, concelebrating angels, and other such occurrences. They are indicative of an extremely high level of sanctity, not only in the recipient of the grace, but all in their disciples also, who have been made worthy to behold them. Of his disciples, a mystical circle existed, consisting of Simon, Isaac, and Micah. These monks were also known to behold the uncreated glory, and obediently reported these revelations to the saint. This is exactly what Saint Dionysius the Areopagite refers to when he writes about the divine energy and rays of divinity, and what Saint Gregory Palamas expands on when he writes, The divine light has not only an allegorical and abstract meaning, it is the fact of mystical experience. Also emphasized in the life and other accounts of Saint Sergius is his famous vision of the Mother of God and the many miracles worked by him. The account of the vision of the Mother of God shows that the saint had the gift of foresight or clairvoyance, as he was able to tell his disciple about what was about to happen. And as he was praying and singing the Thanksgiving canon of the Most Pure, it is the Akafist, and having finished his rule, He sat down for a little rest and said to his disciple, "By the name of Mackay, my child, be temperate and vigilant, for there will be to us a wonderful and awesome visit right now." And while he was still saying this, a voice was heard at the time, "Here comes the most pure herself." And as the saint heard it, he quickly went from his cell into the passage, that is, the entrance, and suddenly great light spread over the saint, greater than the shining sun. And then he saw the purest herself with two apostles, Peter and John, all glittering in indescribable brightness. And as the saint saw this, he prostrated himself, not being able to suffer unbearable dawn. The most pure touched the saint with her hands and said, "Do not be terrified, my chosen. I came to visit you. Your prayer for your disciples for whom you prayed and for your abode was heard. You should not worry anymore, for from now on there will be everything in abundance. And not only as long as you live, but even after your departure to the Lord, I will never leave your refuge, providing all necessities generously and protecting the donors." And having said this, she became invisible. The saint remained in ecstasy of mind and was seized by great fear and trembling. After a while, he came to himself, found his disciple lying in fear as if dead, and he lifted him up. But he fell before the feet of the star, saying, "Explain to me, Father, for the Lord's sake, what was this wonderful vision, for my spirit almost parted because of the radiant vision." The saint, who was rejoicing in his soul, so that his whole figure was blossoming with joy, could answer only this: "Be patient, my child, since my spirit also trembles within me from that wonderful vision." Following this awesome and ecstatic experience, the life records that the saint stayed the whole night without sleep, contemplating in his mind this unutterable vision. This sentence contains within it absolute treasury of hesychastic allusions, mentioning the saint's all-night contemplation of an unutterable vision, contemplation or theoria, being the highest of the spiritual levels attained by spiritual strugglers, and the unutterable vision being one of the finest ways of describing the revelation of the uncreated glory of God, granted to those who have become friends of God. His miracles, although not numerous, were also accounted by Epiphanius and included clairvoyance, healing, and the resurrection of a young boy. Visions such as those of the Mother of God and spiritual gifts, especially clairvoyance, are closely tied with the hesychastic tradition and indicate the high sanctity of the individual in question. St. Sergius's retreat into the desert of the vast Russian forest acted as a catalyst for mass monastic colonization of Russia's northern lands and the formation of many monasteries, mostly founded and led by his disciples. Indeed, evidence does exist for monastic communities existing in this part of Russia from earlier times, but it was the spiritual renaissance that took place at the Holy Trinity Lavra that created a strong and authentic spiritual tradition to carry to the north and transfigure whole tribes and peoples. 11 of St. Sergius's disciples were founders of monasteries, some during his own life, and the Holy Trinity Lavra was responsible for 50 monasteries, which in their turn produced 40 more. While local conditions such as the despoiling of Russia by the Tatars were conducive for the move to the north, there was also strong influence from the Hesychast movement in the Greek lands. As has been mentioned, there were innumerable hesychastic texts available in the Slavic language, and they no doubt proved to be an inspiration for the thousands of monks who ventured into the deserts of Russia, the northern Thebaid. Although it would be wrong to say that all of the 150 or so monasteries that were founded in northern Russia during this period were directly related to St. Sergius, a good majority were. Those that were not developing along similar lines were undoubtedly sustained from the same deep spiritual wells that St. Sergius and his monks drank from. Many accounts of the lives of these strugglers on Russia's frontiers include mention of unceasing prayer, mental prayer, and similar terms, usually denoting hesychastic practices. Following from the spiritual revitalization occurring in the heartlands of Russia, many of these monks, having sanctified themselves in the wilderness, committed themselves to missionary work on its wild frontiers, St. Stephen of Perm being a notable missionary. Moving on from the historical themes that point towards St. Sergius' immersion in the hesychastic tradition, we can now look at the church itself. at how the church itself views the great saint. In the church's liturgical commemorations, his spiritual life is alluded to in a typically poetic fashion. In the Stichera of Small Vespers, on his feast day of the 25th of September, he is referred to as having been united with a light that is utterly pure. In the Apostica of the same service, St. Sergius is mentioned as being worthy to see the divine light. The Stichera of Great Vespers mention his unceasing prayer. The canons at Matins make reference to watchfulness, nepsis, seeing Christ face to face, his being enlightened by bright beams of light, and going into the depth of silence, shining with divine light, and again unceasing prayer. While none of these phrases refer directly to hesychasm, the poetic language used in the services to the saint strongly resembles that used by Athanasius when referring to the saint. St. Sergius' spiritual experiences and can be seen alluding to hesychasm, as these are the kind of terms that one finds in many hesychastic texts. In fact, St. Sergius' services actually have more allusions to hesychasm than those of St. Gregory Palamas. We should therefore not doubt that the Church, when composing the liturgical texts for the saint, considered him as part of the core hesychastic tradition and a carrier of the teachings. Having looked at the historical movements of the era and their influence on St. Sergius, the highly regarded and fairly contemporary accounts of his life, as well as the Church's view, we can conclude that St. Sergius is a definite carrier, practitioner, and transmitter of the hesychastic tradition. Of course, as has been mentioned, we cannot separate hesychasm from orthodox monastic spirituality. But in a time such as his, when the urban monasteries of Russia had mostly become decadent, the transmission of authentic desert Hermetic spirituality was a rare light in the darkness. Evidently spurred on by divine zeal and his God-given spiritual gifts, complemented by his exposure to ascetic and patristic texts, St. Sergius was able to transform Russian spiritual life and reinvigorate the lagging monasticism of the Russian Church. With communications between the Russian and Greek worlds being evident and regular, we cannot doubt the heavy influence of the hesychastic movement under St. Gregory Palamas on the upsurge of Russian monastic spirituality, as well as the greater Balkans region. Upon his death and canonization, the Church recognized his part in this movement, as shown by the liturgical text presented above. Well, we can say that the Church's followers and scholars, both of his era and ours, consider him as a hesychast. Would the saint himself? This last question may be only answered by looking to his extreme humility and coming to our own conclusion. Monk Theodore, 7/18/2020. Coming up on about 45 minutes here. So I think I'm going to take a little break and come back later. My throat's getting pretty dry. A lot of hard words in that one. Thank you, brothers and sisters. God bless you. And I'll be back in a little bit on another stream.